Welcome to this episode of Clinically Pressed. On this episode, we are back with Sean Gallagher of Gallagher Performance. We have talked with Sean multiple times, and every time we do, it is a great conversation. In a previous episode, which we can link up, we talked about just hockey training in general. In this episode, we tie hockey training back into DNS, as Sean was just over before the time of this recording overseas, working with some of the top people in the world when it comes to hockey training. And so we sat down and talked a little bit more specifics about how the principles of DNS are applied to the hockey world. And it ended up, as always, being a really good episode with him. So we look for you to check that out. We are continuing to try and give away these free mobility kits. So please take a look at this video if you're watching it. If not, go back. Just leave us a rating and a review on iTunes. We'll look at it. We will then shout out anybody we can in order to get you that mobility kit. Ships to you free of charge. Has everything you need from a roller to some other implements and mini bands to help you with your prehab and mobility work. So please take a look at that. We desperately want to get these out to people. So with that, please enjoy this episode, and we will talk to you all soon.
We're here with Dr. Sean Gallagher. This will be round 3, and he is fresh off a trip across the pond to, it was Sweden, is that correct?
Yep, just north of Stockholm, Uppsala.
Uppsala.
Probably people would think I'm butchering that, but it's I want to say it's Uppsala.
Okay.
Which actually is home of the, as I learned from my time over there, home of the largest university in Sweden. The town itself is about 350,000 people. 100,000 of that are university students.
Dang. Holy cow.
So it's basically a college university town. But they got a lot of history there. Like the largest cathedral in Sweden's there. So we got a little tour of the town. So it was a DNS course. And the lead instructor was Mikael Truch, who, for people in DNS, he's recognized as Mr. Hockey. He works with the Czech national team. Most famously, he works directly with Jagr. And Jagr, if this isn't a testament for DNS and their methodologies, I don't know what is, because Jagr is still playing professional hockey. He's 47, and I think it was like Friday or Saturday while we were over there, the Czech league started up, and he scored a goal in the first game of the season. So he's been playing pro hockey for 31 years.
That's insane.
That is crazy.
And really no signs of slowing down. So it's fun that you kind of get to pick the brain of Mikael about Jagr and all kind of like his opinion on all the stuff that he does. A lot of it he attributes to genetics, which, you figure it's got to be part of it. But then the guys that actually brought Mikael to Uppsala are the head, basically, if you will, therapists, and also involved in training with the Swedish national team, as well as their U18 and U17 team. So my mind was getting blown all weekend. It's like the Swedish national team is among the best in the world. They're regular contenders for gold medals at international competitions, which is quite interesting when you consider the sheer size of Sweden relative to some other countries. And then you look at the number of NHL players they produce. And you look at relative, let's just say to US or Canada. So kind of get some interesting insight into some of their player development. And then what they're doing, which is a lot of integration of DNS, but they're like head, if you will, like if you want to call them therapists, trainers, they're naturopaths by license. So they do manipulation, mobilization, acupuncture, dry needling, or, they'll utilize stuff with the electrical current. I mean, they use a lot of the modalities that we can commonly use depending upon state scope definition. And then, the exercise side of it, with huge emphasis on DNS. Yeah, like their guys have done all the way up to C course.
Okay.
Yeah. So quite knowledgeable.
So in my understanding, you were the only American there?
Yeah. Well, that and just the only guy from North America, period.
Wow.
They said they had interest from others, but nobody that pulled the trigger on going. There was 15 of us in class. And I guess at one point they had around, it was close to 40 people interested, but for different reasons, be it due to travel, either from North America or other parts of Europe, just didn't, couldn't piece together from, or they had other hockey guys that are supposed to come, but a challenging thing with that time of year is a lot of teams are rolling into season. So a lot of their trainers and therapists could not leave.
Gotcha.
But that was the only weekend, as I was told, that Mikkel was open for this. He's completely booked through 2021. And it's unlikely at this point if they'll do another hockey DNS. And if they do, it would be maybe 2022 or 2023 at the earliest.
That's insane.
But it's because he's Mr. Hockey when it comes to DNS, and he's just, you can't get him. Like the guys from the Swedish team told me that they set this thing up almost over a year and a half ago. Wow. That's when they started trying to do this at the beginning of 2018. The earliest weekend they could get Mikkel to come was September 19th, 20th of 2019.
So what's he doing if he's not doing the hockey courses? Then is he?
Well, he doesn't do hockey specific courses. This is the first time he's ever done a hockey specific course. It's just between his instructor travel for DNS in general, work at the hospital, travel with the Czech national team, other obligations. A lot of his weekends and stuff get tied up very quickly, and then there's weekends he needs in Prague with his family.
Yeah, understandable.
So he's a very tough man to schedule.
Wow.
Apparently.
That's really cool.
So,
I had no
but
idea
with
the hockey.
Go ahead.
I had no idea he did so much of the hockey. When I did my course, it was with him, and that was several years back. So yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, I don't. He's been doing it now for probably the better part about 5 or 6 years now. Where I think prior to him it was more Pavel. Because I've seen pictures of Pavel working on Jagr, or Pavel on the bench with the Czech national team. So, my first course with Mikkel was back in 2008 with Craig Morris in Davenport. And back then he wasn't doing work with hockey. So he's like, I think he's stepped into that more recent. Like, I want to say he said it was around 2013 or 2014 is when he started that work.
So what were some of the biggest takeaways for you then?
Well, so the context of it was a DNS exercise 1 course. So for many people that were there, it was their first DNS course. We had a lot of therapists, naturopaths, there was massage therapists. We had some trainers. Work with one guy I got to meet over there was pretty cool. He works with the Columbus Blue Jackets. Basically, when all their Swedish players are there in the off season, he trains them. So he's kind of like a consultant and go between, right? And his cool story is he played with Peter Forsberg on their national team. So if some people know Peter Forsberg, he's probably one of the maybe considered the best player that came from Sweden.
Okay.
So which is kind of cool for me because I grew up. I was a big fan of Forsberg's and his style of play, and we can dive more into that because we're learning some things from him about what made Peter great as a player was probably that he did everything very well that DNS teaches about, be it centration or keeping a low center of gravity, because they would say you couldn't outmuscle him on the ice. That was one of the strengths of his game is he could push anybody around and he could handle the physicality of the game. And so some of the stuff that he was thinking about almost retrospectively was like he just probably – so it's because a lot of this stuff that DNS deals with is subcortical. You have your cortical motor patterns, but these are programs or patterns that are heavily influenced through the first, 1-2 years of development. And, with a lot of great athletes, they have great subconscious or subcortical control of their body. And then the athletes that are often injured have poor subcortical control. And so somebody like Peter just things just click. He knows where his center of mass should be, knows how to basically centrate his entire body for efficiency and skating and leverage and shooting. And while he would say like he was not the strongest guy in the gym, he was always the strongest guy on the ice. Like Mikael would go, he's like, yeah, like a lot of the stuff we were going over, which was kind of very interesting. Like you say, like wrestlers and martial artists are very good at how to use their body and their core to lever and how to keep their center of mass low. It's like some of that, like I've seen McGill do stuff like Japanese stick fighting, stuff like that, almost like this tug of war where those type of athletes are really good at that stuff. But sometimes you get these hockey guys that have no idea how to create those leverages and advantages. And that's a lot of that's subcortical. You're engaged in a battle and not really thinking about the inner workings of your body, but some of them it just all clicks for. So, like being in an exercise-based course, there were things that we addressed on that end of the spectrum. But also, if you're dealing with an athlete, hockey athlete that's got painful shoulders, painful hips, back, what have you, and the common reasons why that develops relative to the skating pattern or shooting, because hockey is a unique blend of contralateral and ipsilateral patterns, as like they would define it in DNS. So, shooting, like most or pretty much all rotational activities, is ipsilateral. So, we would use different rolling patterns for that. And a lot of it just came back to stuff that we, can kind of take for granted with intra-abdominal pressure, sagittal stabilization, and how that's critical for dissociation of femoral acetabular internal and external rotation, which a lot of hockey players are really poor with because of the tension in the hips and the tendency to fall into anterior tilt of the pelvis and a lot of extensive compressive forces in the lumbar spine. And then you get very tight rectus. And then when you get that tight rectus, it's hard to separate out the femur from the pelvis. So you start to see a lot of postures that become more primitive or reminiscent of a newborn, right? Like if you put a newborn in prone, and you'll see their pelvis and anterior tilt. And because as Mikael would say, like for the newborn, the rectus hasn't released, and it don't allow the pelvis to take that posterior tilt and the femur to basically come, anterior in the socket. He's like, and you'll find that with hockey players because of that flexed posture that you got to regular maintain. So, it's just you see these presentations in a lot of populations for different reasons. You might see that in just people walking around because they got poor abdominal control. They're not necessarily an athlete. They're just, they've got lower cross syndrome.
Sure.
So what was neat was, we did a lot of focus on, okay, if they're getting pain driven through skating or shooting or stuff like that, that might bring to light. Okay, if it's a skating pattern, we might use more contralateral focus, prone, different crawling. If it's rotational, they might go, supine positions, oblique sits, stuff like that. To work on the timing and the sequencing of those patterns. But then we got into some manual therapy conversations too, about what to do, because they're, being a group of 15, this was one, I didn't expect this. Being a group of 15, it was such a intimate learning environment. Like Mikael was really open with some of the manual stuff that they'll do prior to DNS exercises, and especially because like the guys that work with the Swedish national team, it's like, all right, when these guys come off the ice or before the ice, we don't have an hour with them. You got 20, 30 guys on the team, like you'd be there all day. So you have a narrow window to work with them, and you want high quality and you want efficiency. So Mikael was sharing some of his go-tos in that sense. If he's got a guy coming off and maybe he's got patellar tendonitis, showing us some of his patellar mobilizations, and then how he would probably train them, and maybe go like supine to oblique sit, maybe some low hanging, or if they can tolerate it, some quadruped positions, because oftentimes you're going to find issues with the hip and the lateral hip, and that may be creating compressive forces not only within like almost a hip impingement, but you get all that tension through the IT band and the vastus lateralis. So doing releases and patterns to basically get that tension out of the system. And it's like, all right, if you only have like 5 to 10 minutes with a player, here, bang, 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 bang. So, but yeah, it was that was the main focus of the course. Like, you did they introduced some of the basic screens in DNS, and then from there, like between like intra-abdominal pressurization, stabilization patterns, be it prone, supine, so on. But then, the exercises and then the manual therapy was another side of it that was really fascinating, because that, unless you're doing, I think, some of the AB courses, that doesn't really get addressed. Even when Kyle, as you remember, when Jaron would bring in some of the therapists to Davenport, they didn't do a whole lot with us on the manual side of stuff.
Right.
So he was pretty much an open book, which was pretty cool.
That is cool.
Where do you fall on like your go-tos with manual therapy? And I only ask because going back to when, I don't remember, was it exercise 1, like the first one we went to? Brett Winchester was teaching it and talking about his work with the pitchers and
Mm,
talking about like trigger points and like the pec and whatnot, and how he wouldn't
yeah,
necessarily go right after it, but would first run him through kind of the oblique sideline shoulder. I'm so bad at this.
The little oblique sit. Yep.
Yeah, that one.
yeah,
And do that, and he would have good success with that trigger point, in essence, like unwinding itself without actually like going in and mechanically going after it.
yep,
I've always thought was fascinating, and just something that I know with the staff here and just what I've seen, it's just like, oh, the pain's here, and we just go to it. But
yep.
you having gone through a lot of this, and I know Kyle and I have had this conversation and looking at different things. I don't know, I was just curious your thoughts, if you've got
Yeah.
things that you go to, or
That's something I've like back and forth, because like you, I've heard Brett talk about that stuff, and it's always piqued my interest. Where like Levitt talked about the chain reactions in the body, and certain trigger point chains, and the disturbed function of the motor system. So you'll find very characteristically patterns of trigger points associated with, be it, neck, shoulder, thoracic spine, hip, and so on. So you can predictably find those patterns of trigger points, which I always like to do. I think it gets my mind focusing in on, where the problem is at. If I'm dealing with, certain thoracic spine rotation, fixation, or blockage, or cervical spine. But then it's, for example, Mikel would, if we were looking at things in terms of shoulder pain, and one of the big things there was like an overhead reach. And if you're seeing a blockage or a restriction or tightness on one side versus the other, typically you're going to get a counter rotation fixation of the thoracic spine, and then up into the cervical, predictably trigger points. If it's on that, in my case, the right side in the upper trap, SCM scalenes, you can get the pec. So you can start putting that all together, like, okay, hey, we know where some of the problems are at, and it may direct me from an adjusting standpoint, which I like. So if I'm dealing with that, then I'm not getting that certain spinous rotation in the thoracic spine, so that will influence me how I set up, like on an anterior, or the way I may adjust in prone, and then even up on into the cervical spine, because that hypertonicity is going to pull those spinuses and that rotation to that right. So when I set up for, like, I want to know, I don't want to drive into the problem, I'm going to correct. So sometimes after my I will adjust first. Sometimes you can find changes within the trigger points almost immediately just from the adjustive side. Depending upon the level of hypertonicity and range of motion, restriction, or sensitivity, I might go to manual work after that. Or, because, honestly, that's what Mikel does. He does all of his manual stuff first, from what he expressed to us. But then there's people like Brett that may go right into an exerciser position and then let that almost a reciprocal inhibition take over, and you might see that trigger point disappear. As I remember, when I was in Orlando in March, I listened to Brett speak, and at the rehab symposium for the ACA, and one of his quotes was, trigger points are a good thing in a poor functioning system. They're almost there strategically. So, I wouldn't be someone to just do manual therapy and kick someone out the door, because those trigger points are going to be quick to return, or maybe you just rob them of an inherent stability mechanism or motor control mechanism, and they may be more predisposed to maybe exacerbating their issue. And then Mikel used a quote while we were over there from Pavel, that he says, trigger points exist in the brain, not in the muscle.
I think I've heard that one before.
So that was the first time I've heard that quote. I liked it.
Yeah.
So I think it's anything you can do to impact through the sensory system to make the change. But then obviously, they're big on that, the subcortical and the cortical integration. So, be it through some sort of DNS exercise or some sort of other exercise or corrective, to kind of, you're resetting the system through manual therapy, but then trying to like maybe reinforce, retrain, through the exercise or through the awareness. So I think either way, you can't go wrong. I think I ting back and forth with patients all the time. Because even some, I'm sure you guys can appreciate, there's some people I have that just, they respond really well going either direction. And I just maybe try to stick with that if I learn that pattern with them. Yeah.
Sure. It goes to that patient expectation and beliefs in the whole
Yeah.
process.
Yeah. That was interesting. Like, even something with like, a shoulder flexion pattern. Mikkel was talking about in some of his experience, he found, he might go through some of the flexors of the forearm and the bicep and up the chain, where he'll do fascial manipulation, basically release some of the fascial tissue he's fine, and then boom, that pattern
right
immediately better. So, so for him, he'll oftentimes think of what kind of manual resets he can do, and then once he gets that, then he goes to his DNS. Yeah. So, and I'd say that's where I am the majority of the time. I don't know what that means, if it's like 70-30, but I would say probably more than half the people I work with, I do my manual work first and then go into my active exercises.
Sure. Makes sense. Did you see any major differences between, as what kind of like USA hockey does compared to, what your work over there, what they do in Sweden versus, what they talked about with the Czech team?
Well, interestingly, I think this would be a totally different conversation if we did this probably 4 or 5 years ago. But USA Hockey and their, not only just their coaching education program, it's like I'm a level 3 coach with USA Hockey, and there's 5 levels to that. But so I've been through their level, their coaching education program up to that point. And I would have done 4, but since I'm not coaching actively right now, I'm not. I haven't pursued it. But they have kind of what they call an athletic development model, or their ADM within USA Hockey, which they introduce you to in their coaching education program, which has actually been heavily influenced by people going over to Sweden to understand what it is they're doing with their players at a young age, kind of systematically, not only physically, but psychologically, and handling the little nuances of how, kids, like at a young age, they're not psychologically ready for the rigors of competition, and that heavy focus on wins and losses and so on, so even at a young age with kids, what to really focus them on, mentally, and not putting so much emphasis on wins and losses and the competitive side of it, but like kind of grooming them into that. And, USA Hockey, you look at it years ago, and it's kind of what I experienced as a young player, is you might be on an 8-year-old on an entire sheet of ice by yourself, right? And that's a lot of space for young kids. But, if you look at hockey, even though it's played on a large surface, it's really small area game. It's like the game's basically won and lost in the corners and the front of the net, and little battles and trying to outnumber and create little 2-on-1s on the ice and outnumber your opponent like a chess match. And that's a huge emphasis that the Swedish development system has. So they do a lot of what they call small area games with their young players, so they get better at decision making, quicker hands, better feet, and then you throw them out on a big ice surface and all of a sudden I got so much time and space. And if you look at some of those guys that come from, be it Sweden, Finland, they're very crafty in tight areas. They're very good decision makers. They're headsy with the puck. They're just like fundamentally very sound. And so that's why USA Hockey wanted to go over and learn from it. And that's been integrated into the youth development model more and more at a young age with the focus on small area games. And it's not uncommon, at least here in my area, where you might have on the ice at one time 3 young kid teams, and one's in one end, one's in the neutral zone, and one's in the other end. And they got little nets, and they're doing a lot of focus on basically what they call small area games, where little 2-on-1s, 2-on-2s, learning how to position yourself efficiently on the ice, make good reads. And a lot of that's that like kind of the motor system, and it's fed by the visual system. It's something that Mikael talked about a lot in how they train them, but the using the eyes, the eyes are big in DNS, right? The oral facial system. And from an exercise standpoint over there, just training players how to, pull stuff, like in focus, separate things out from the background, 3D, peripheral vision, stuff like that. So they need that developed very well to see the ice, and have that ability, like that depth perception. If Kyle were a team and we got Joel defending us, and I'm not necessarily looking at you, but through a crowd of, I need to be able to distinguish his stick from yours. And if I got to sauce the puck over his stick to yours to make that perfect pass, I got to be able to make that read like that and visually make that distinction. So, I think a lot of that's feeding into those small area games too, because those are really difficult plays to make in hockey. But if you can make those regularly, then you have high success.
Sure.
So I think what USA Hockey is doing has been, in general, been heavily influenced by some of those countries over there, principally Sweden. So I don't think there's a whole lot different that's going on. I would say some of the conversations I had with the guys that work with the Swedish national team and even Mikael, I think the way they approach physical preparation is, and actually training and conditioning their athletes is, it's on another level. And the biggest difference is this. I think strength training, and obviously we can go a lot of different ways with that. But one of the conversations I had with the Swedish guys was, and that this is just by comparison, with some of the college and junior guys that we've worked with, you'll hear this a lot. Like there's commonly, 300-meter runs that are used, right? Because they want to train that anaerobic threshold and that lactate threshold system and quote mimic a shift, because most people will want to have someone run a 300-meter or 300-yard shuttle or something in anywhere from like 51 to 55 seconds. Okay, so like for example, our guy that plays at Stevens Point, they'll do I think upwards of 5 300-meter runs as their conditioning test, and they're expected to run those like I think 52 or 53 seconds or better, and you get 2 minutes rest in between. Okay. Now, by comparison, the Swedish national team, okay, this is a workout. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a workout that they do. Okay. So they'll do 300-meter shuttles. Okay. And the players are going to run those around 53 to 55 seconds. And they don't want to see a big drop off. They want to see that consistency. 2-minute rest. And they do anywhere from 9 to 16 of those.
Oh my gosh.
And here in America, like people think two, 3, or 4 300s is a lot.
Yep.
But that's what they, even through their U17, U18 to get them to the national team. That's what the national team guys are doing regularly, and they go through it. So it's like I think on the whole that some kids over here just in general are just their fitness is greatly lagging, and then to get someone's fitness to that level, I think most people are like, nah, screw it, don't care, I don't need that. But they make all their guys do that unless they're injured or they just have some sort of intolerance to running. Then they, they'll find other means, by be it a bike or whatnot. But with very rare exception, they run all their guys like that in the off season. Yeah. So, yeah, I was pretty blown away when I heard that. Because I mean, even being through it myself, like, yeah, I've done workouts where I've tried 4 or 5 300s, and that's a gasser. Like you're pretty spent by the end of it. They're nearly doubling or tripling that on a regular basis.
Dang, that sounds awful. So,
but they start them at a young age, and then they build them up to being able to have those work capacities.
Right.
Sure. You try to do that with some of our kids now, it would crush them because they just don't have that. They don't have that built-in work capacity already. It's okay. I mean, for some of them, even just doing 3 or 4 300 shuttles is brutal. I mean, my conditioning test for our high school program is 6 200-yard shuttles. It's nothing. Yeah. Compared to that, and I have kids that are on the brink of puking regularly.
Yeah,
they're holding it back, and I even give them more rest. It's a better work to rest ratio. Okay. They're almost working at a 1 to 2 with theirs. I'm a little bit more forgiving, but it's just you get I start working with kids oftentimes when they're 12 or 13, and they're, from a physical conditioning standpoint, they're already behind the 8 ball. And so you can't really accelerate that process, because if you try to accelerate it, it's just going to lead to overtraining, or it's going to be detrimental to them.
Yeah, it's having the patience to build it.
Yeah, but a lot of those, that's the whole other conversation between parents and players, just not having the patience. Yeah.
Or getting the kids that want to put in the work. I mean,
also part of it.
Yeah.
Question before, but we've kind of come up with a question of, in something in your world that is complicated, how would you make that simple?
Okay.
And so asking you that question kind of around the DNS approach with hockey, you'd like to distill that down as kind of like a
okay. So all right. So I would say, from a standpoint of hockey player, like one of the things that Mikkel hit on a lot, actually it was interesting because we did a lot of work on just gait and ground-based locomotive patterns, and getting appropriate, kind of foot mechanics through the big toe for extension, and how if you can't access that, then you don't get the glute and extension, because you're looking at these patterns of gait through extension and internal rotation and pronation. And so with a lot of the hockey players, they're very limited in internal rotation in the hip, because the lateral rotators of the hip get tight, and they get a lot of impingement. So therefore they're going to have a harder time accessing, sometimes getting into some of those internal rotation mechanisms of extension and pronation through the foot. So looking at that as a chain, if you're dealing with hip issues, which are very common in the hockey player, then think of it as, okay, look at the foot. Look how they load through the foot. Look how they load through the foot through toe off in walking patterns, running patterns, jumping, stuff like that. Because if they're not getting through to basically that metatarsal head, they're not going to fully access the glute. So there's a lot of retraining of that, not only in DNS patterns, but certain other exercises. And then in doing that too, trying to do more quad release. So I think, you can have these like litany of problems with a hockey player. They come in with pain and you're trying to understand stuff, but it's almost like you can almost treat them in a way like you would a runner. Their toe off, they're really big. They need that quality pronation and eversion through the foot with toe off on skating. So it's a little bit of a different mechanism with running. But if they aren't able to do that through the foot, the hip's going to suffer too. So basically, kind of keeping it simple is like sometimes looking at them, we weren't really looking at it much different than a ground-based athlete. So I think you don't have to completely dismiss some of the stuff that you already put into practice with some of those other athletes. There just might be different mechanisms behind what's feeding it, just from their sport and the repetitive nature of the sport, and that they need tremendous amounts of sagittal plane stability in their core, because skating, most players, it's flex posture, anterior tilt, they get that open scissor effect. And so you'll find that they become very extensive, compressive in the lumbar spine, weak in the abdominals. So classic patterns that you see a lot of. So it's like between those, like you can't go wrong. You can do so good with living in those zones with a hockey player.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Appreciate taking the time. I'm sure
Yeah,
experience for you.
Absolutely, boys.
We'll have a part 4 coming soon, I'm sure. I can sit.
Yeah. Hey, I like it.
So.
All right. Hey, you guys have a good one. Always good talking.
We'll be in touch.
Take care.
All right. Take care.
Thank you for checking out this episode of Clinically Pressed. Go to clinicallypressed.com for full show notes and links to everything that was covered in this episode. While you're there, you have access to all of our episodes, insights, and shorts. You can find Clinically Pressed on YouTube and any podcast outlet. If you could give us a rating, thumbs up, or review on how we are doing, we would greatly appreciate it. To get more free content delivered to your inbox, sign up for the Total Athletic Therapy newsletter. You'll get direct links to all new Clinically Pressed episodes, reviews on some of the latest research in health and performance, and links to related podcasts and other items meant to help you make the complicated simple and optimize performance. Thank you for listening, and see you next episode.